So let me ask you another question here. Why don't you flesh out for us a little bit, based on your experience in the lab and otherwise, the nature of narcissism, exactly what you've been studying. What are these people like, and how do you identify them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little complicated because the term narcissism, we think about it as both a personality trait, an individual difference. And what we mean by a trait is somebody's, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are consistent across time and situation. So somebody acts the way in one situation, they act the way in another situation, they'll probably act the same way in 6 months. And in terms of narcissism, we find that in the personality world, there's sort of two different flavors or two different forms of narcissism. What most of us are talking about is this more grandiose form, this, as you said, disagreeable extroverts. So people that are self-centered, have a sense of superiority, have a sense of entitlement, but are also assertive, agentic, maybe charismatic, extroverted, driven. So that combination of grandiosity is what you see in your classic ex-boyfriend, your politician, your celebrity. That's that profile. And then there's the more vulnerable form of narcissism, which people don't talk about as much, where you have that antagonism, but you also have things like envy comes out a lot more with vulnerable narcissism. And you see a lot of envy right now. And then you also get a lot of neuroticism. So people who are vulnerable narcissists appear more, they might appear depressed or anxious. And then you kind of get to know them and you're like, wait, you're kind of self-centered too. You kind of think people don't. So they're kind of the more passive narcissists.
Now, is that the axis? Okay, so is the fundamental axis of discrimination there trait neuroticism? Like if you take your extroverted, disagreeable, unconscientious person, let's say, so the real kind of narcissist that's bordering on psychopathy, and then you break them into two types. You'd have the low neuroticism, fearless, movie villain type of implacable predatory narcissist, but then you could flip that and you could say, well, what about the people who are really high in neuroticism? Well, they can be just as narcissistic, as you pointed out, but they're going to be depressed and anxious, claim victimization. They're going to use their suffering as a means of manipulating people. Like, is it neuroticism that's the distinguisher between vulnerable and grandiose narcissism?
The neuroticism, and also you'll see lower extroversion with more vulnerable narcissism. So the extroversion won't be as high and the neuroticism will be higher. So it's driven more, it's more of a defensive structure. I don't want people to criticize. It's sometimes called thin-skinned narcissism. I'm looking for people trying to criticize me. Whereas people who are more grandiose are like, I'm looking for an opportunity to shine. Hey, there's a camera, here's a microphone. Awesome. So it's a little different. It's like approach versus avoidance orientation. And of course, some people have characteristics of both. But that's the main distinction that we've seen in the literature. And that took about 20 years to sort out. It sounds crazy, but because of the history, because what happened historically is the clinicians who were seeing narcissism were often seeing more vulnerability. The people who were studying narcissism in the world of leadership were seeing much more grandiosity, sort of like studying
or criminals or the criminal people.
Or in criminality, they're seing more grandiosity. And so you ended up with sort of two theories coming together. And then there's the issue of what's a personality disorder. And that's typically when you take that narcissism and a narcissistic personality disorder is grandiose, but also has elements of vulnerability in it. And you make it extreme and then inflexible. So one of the challenges, if I'm narcissistic on stage, that's fine. But if I go home and I'm that way with my kids, I'm that way with my wife, I'm going to have problems. So when your personality becomes inflexible, then you get the impairment. You ruin your relationships. You take too big of risks at work. You're too self-centered to learn from your mistakes. So you're overconfident. You make bad business decisions. Whatever the case is, you have that sort of impairment. And that's where you start talking about a personality disorder. People with a personality disorder, it's the extreme narcissism. Sometimes there's some trauma, something going on in childhood that maybe makes it more fixed. But generally, it's just the extreme with impairment. And then people have noticed some other kinds of narcissism. Sometimes people talk about communal narcissism, which are people that take the enhancements more like I'm the best friend ever. I'm the most moral person ever. So it's a more moralistic face on narcissism. Sometimes in the clinical world, they'll talk about malignant narcissism as a specifier. So it's I'm narcissistic, but I'm also sort of sadistic and pathological and mean. So there's that kind of darker face of narcissism. So you can move this around in different ways, but typically it's that combination of, that disagreeable extrovert personality. And then what you're doing is that self-regulation is about gaining positive attention and avoiding negative attention. So gaining attention, gaining status, gaining power.